You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about a recent Breakpoint Forum John held about whether and how Christians should engage politics. We're also going to talk about the unrest in the UK and what cultural implications that has. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, this week we had a Breakpoint Forum, and this was a live stream event where you and Denise Grace Gitcham, who wrote Politics for People Who Hate Politics, and Eric Tietzel talked about the Christian involvement in politics. And people wrote in a lot of really thoughtful questions, some of which you guys got to during the forum, but we also had way more questions than we had time to get to at that event. So I have some of those questions here now, and I thought maybe we could start the show today talking through some of the ones that we didn't get a chance to tackle that night.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is just tell everyone how our guests would have answered. So I will answer for them. And
so if you get mad,
it's not me.
Right
it's
to
really
them.
There was a couple things that came up in particular, and somewhat predictably, the questions or the critiques, and I understand that. This is not an easy thing, water to wade into. But at the Colson Center, we think that Jesus is Lord of everything, including politics. We also think that humans are sinners, including us, not just them. And, you put all that together in a particularly charged environment, which I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in a particularly charged environment.
I don't know what you mean.
Yeah. And, there's also the backdrop, and I want to repeat this. People are going to think that I'm just saying the same thing, but I am. And that is, we live in a moment in which politics has sucked all the air out of the room. And that in and of itself says something about us. When every conversation becomes political, when conversations about church become political, when conversations about medicine become political. Now, at some level, they've become political because the players involved have been politicized in some way or another, but also our perspectives have. It's no surprise I'm a fan of Abraham Kuyper, his understanding of sphere sovereignty, that there are different aspects of God's creation, and that includes spheres of society, and those spheres need to have at some level kind of a separate autonomy in and of themselves. So there is you don't want the state intruding on the family. You don't want the family intruding on the church. They're very much related, but there needs to be a separation in a sense. When that breaks down, that tells you something about the cultural moment. And when there's really nothing in between the state and the citizen, then we are moving away from a description of at least the American project that Alexis de Tocqueville described as being something pretty positive about the American context when he wrote about 19th century America, that there was just a whole lot more to America than the state. There were these mediating institutions, these structures of society that help these individual spheres take care of themselves. And it just says an awful lot about how deep we are into what Jacques Ellul called the political illusion when we make every conversation about politics. And so in and of itself, the way we have this conversation, I think, reveals a lot about the moment that we're in. But Christianity is a worldview, not just a self-view. It is a vision of reality, not just a personal, private crutch or something like that. So we have to weigh into all aspects of human existence, and especially at a time when there's, I think, so much conflict and so much controversy. And I thought that the forum went really, really well. I thought there was some really helpful things. I would wish we could have gotten to more topics. And maybe we can do that here this morning.
Yeah. One of the questions that came in was asking why this person felt that the panel was one-sided, and they were frustrated that you did not include a Democratic point of view, so someone who openly identified as a Democratic person or voter. And another question that came in as related asked why you didn't put forth Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a viable third option in this presidential election. And I think those are kind of related. This is one of those areas where I know that we've tried to thread this needle, and I think usually we do a really good job of this under your leadership, of course, but threading the needle between talking about the Christian worldview of politics and how that informs what we do politically, while not kind of getting into the weeds of individual politicians. Of course, that's going to have to be important at some level because we need to know who these people are that want to have authority in this way and what they believe and what they say. But it's hard to always know, how to skirt that line. So I'm going to let you attempt to do that here and not me. But why didn't you have anybody who said they were a Democrat on the panel? And what about RFK?
Well, let me take that in reverse order. We did talk about third-party voting, which I think is where a lot of folks are who feel that both candidates are morally compromised, at least at the top of the ticket. Of course, one of the big headlines of what we've been saying over and over and over, using this framework of lessening evil and trying to put a little skin on what that maybe looks like, is how important it is down ballot, how important it is at the state level. And once you start talking about that, you're no longer talking about three parties in most races. You're not talking about that when it comes to, voting to retain judges, or you're not talking about that when you're talking about the ballot initiatives. You're not even talking about that when you're talking about a lot of school board races or local races, because there's not third parties represented. And so when we were talking about that, we weren't talking about any candidates whatsoever. So to mention Robert F. Kennedy by name is just not something we would say, or for that matter, Cornel West.
Is he running?
He is. You didn't know that?
All right. No, I did not.
And there you go. I mean, and of course, that's the other answer is that at least where we're at now, there's no such thing as a viable third party candidate. There is such a thing as a third party spoiler, which of course Ross Perot played, as many analysts will look at, years ago. And it seems that the third party support for RFK seems to be dropping. And now we're just talking about poll numbers. But he had kind of garnered a pretty high level for third parties, or as third parties go, given the very low popularity ratings of the two candidates when it was President Biden and former President Trump at the top of the ticket. So some of those realities are changing on the ground all the time, but it wasn't an intentional omission. It was just we were talking about these things in principle, which we tend to do. As far as the quote unquote balance, I thought maybe the question came in a little bit before we addressed an aspect of this. Maybe that's really clear. I asked Eric Tietzel, for example, are the two parties equal? Now, he had offered a framework, and I meant morally so, but he had offered a framework that I thought was pretty helpful, or at least some realities on the ground that you have to consider. That on each side, when you're looking at a candidate, you got three features. Number one is the philosophy of the movement that they represent. So you have a conservative movement and a progressive movement. You have the party alignment with that movement, and then you have the candidate alignment with the party and with the movement. And those things could be in a straight line, or they could all be, crooked. We have talked very, very plainly about the misalignment of the conservative movement and the GOP party platform right now, given the pretty significant changes on the issues of life and family. There is more alignment, I think, between the progressive vision or the progressive philosophy and the Democratic platform as it's moved more on at least those two issues. And those aren't the only two issues, but more on that here in a second. Eric Tietzel, our guest, said something really clear, is that no, the progressive philosophy is not in alignment with a Christian worldview. We were wrestling with a Christian worldview of voting. We dealt with the left, not as in terms of candidates. We talked about that actually on Breakpoint just today, a commentary dealing with some comments made by Pete Buttigieg, which is a really hard thing to say. That name when you're doing it in a hurry. Listeners will know that was my fourth take on that name.
You missed something really spectacular.
You missed some fun stuff there, but we're hopefully they got edited or Carlos is fired. Pete Buttigieg, where he basically said abortion is a means of male freedom
He's not wrong. He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. No, he's actually absolutely right. And it's a horrific way of thinking about sexuality and thinking about women's dignity and the rights and well-being of children, and completely misses the things that are to be conserved in order to have a strong foundation for a healthy and flourishing society. So that's the philosophical distance between a Christian worldview and that progressive philosophy. Inasmuch a candidate does or does not embrace that philosophy is how we have to evaluate the candidates, and then everything that the candidate represents. So no, we won't have at this point, because of the alignment of the progressive vision of reality and the party platform. A spokesperson for that is not in the realm of a Christian worldview. Now, the response, and we got this response, is what about on issues of immigration? What about on issues of caring for the poor? What about on issues of, and then you fill in the blank. And I answer that. Number one is, I think that's a talking point. Yes, Jesus talked about all of that. He did not give all of that to the purview of the state. The state's actually not good at compassion. That's not the state's job. When others do not step into the compassion gap, that's when the state has to. And we are now at a point in human history where we don't argue about whether to help the poor. We argue about how to help the poor. And the critiques of those who want non-state actors to help the poor is that the state's not good at it. And the critique of those on the left, including major, kind of media publications and so on, is that if you do not think it's the state's job, then you do not think the poor should be helped. I don't accept that analysis. Now, we could say that we're not doing it well. We could say that people are falling through the gaps. We could say that the church or other players, non-state actors, need to do better. I will say all of those things. I will also say, as I did the other night, and we talked a little bit about this, is that there's a hierarchy of issues. I'm convinced of this. There are, and this is why we've been so critical of the GOP platform shift. And we've got people writing us, calling us naive. Of course, in this job, one of my favorite parts are all the people who tell me what Chuck would have said and Chuck Colson would have done. I knew Chuck, is the email that I get. And I appreciate that. A lot of people feel like they really knew Chuck, and I do as well. And none of us knew him as well as probably we think we did. And I'm because we really disagree on, whether he would have completely, whether he would have been silent on this. I am absolutely convinced Chuck would have been as alarmed as I am, maybe more, seeing this shift in the GOP platform away from the two things he believed were fundamental issues that needed to be conserved. He had three. He wrote about them. It was called the Manhattan Declaration. We did have this conversation that life, marriage, and religious and conscience rights are things that you can't compromise. If you don't get those right, you don't get things downstream right. That's what he believed. We did have this conversation in 2007. I remember this conversation very, very clear about whether when you vote, there's a hierarchy of issues that you should consider, or you should just line them all up and then, say, this party's 2 out of 10, that party's 8 out of 10. He believed that life, marriage, and conscience rights were fundamental. That was the content and the substance of the Manhattan Declaration. And so for a conservative party to move away from two of those things, at least, it would have been alarming, for him. And that's the way we have to add. That's the way we have to walk into this. That's the way we have to be informed. I will say, and I've become more convinced. I was on a podcast this week, Maria, with Abdu Murray, and we were having this conversation. I don't know when it'll air. It'll probably be down the road. But, he said something really interesting about this approach that we're trying to flesh out about the lesser of two evils versus lessening evil. And he said, it seems like lessening evil actually leaves you something positive you can do, because it's a good thing when you can lessen evil. And I said, well, I appreciate that. I think that's true. As opposed to being a victim of whoever is at the top of the ticket. But I also think that this approach requires being a more informed voter than just listening to the talking points from whichever media echo chamber you're in. You got to do a little bit more work than that. And I think that's a good call for Christians who do not think that everything is going to be accomplished in November, because it will not, who do not place the fate of society in the hands of whoever gets in office, because that's not where it rests, although it matters greatly. And so being able to kind of walk and chew gum in that sense, I think, is maybe what's helpful.
I think it's helpful, too, to say that when you talk about a hierarchy of issues, you don't mean that these are all like separately siloed issues that we rank in terms of importance, but that when you use the word fundamental, that's how Chuck described this life, marriage, and family and conscience rights, or
foundational. Yeah, I think he probably used the word foundational.
And I want to point out that I appreciate this question, and it's a thoughtful question about whether we should have had somebody who identifies as a Democrat on this panel and in this discussion. But one of the other things that this person wrote in this question was, "I agree with you that abortion is abhorrent." I'm paraphrasing. I agree that abortion is abhorrent, but there are worse things than babies being sent prematurely to Jesus. And I'm just going to say as clearly as I can, I don't think there are. I actually don't think there are worse things than that. And I want to be charitable. I think maybe what this person meant was kind of thinking about these issues again in a sort of siloed way. Like, well, there's this emergency and this building's on fire over here, and there's all these different, and we have to think of all of them at once. But I think what you're saying, and probably what Chuck would have said, is that the way you approach human life will impact and infect every other policy you have in every other area. And if you can't say as a leader or as a culture that we cannot kill babies, we cannot kill innocent people, and that our own, whatever we perceive to be our own autonomous rights or freedom from all constraints, that cannot preside over, like that does not take precedence over the right of an innocent image bearer of God to life, then you're going to get almost everything else wrong. And even when we feel like we're turning a corner, and now let's talk about poverty, and let's talk about the policies that we employ to try and fight poverty. If you don't understand the human person and you don't respect what a human person is, you're never going to get that right. You can have great intentions. You can talk about it more eloquently than others. You can seem more compassionate to other people. But if you don't know what people are and you don't care about them as inherently dignified and valuable people from the moment that they become people, then I have no reason to trust that your anti-poverty measures or whatever you're talking about is going to be successful. And I think we can see that in every major city across the United States right now.
And there's more, right? I agree with everything you just said. And then, would add two things. Number one is one of the most prominent arguments for abortion rights is so kids will not go into poverty. So think about that applied across the board to trot out the toddler. Well, we could keep toddlers from being poor. We could keep, women who were the victims of domestic violence from being poor if we kill the victim. I mean, we would never accept this as a legitimate solution across the board. So before the accusation goes out that you're, unfairly connecting the issues, we're not the only ones that do that. And because they are, I think, inherently connected.
I mean, Pete Buttigieg saying that abortion is a matter of men's freedom. One of the number one reasons women cite for pursuing an abortion is that they don't have the support of the baby's father financially or emotionally. And so like that directly feeds into the problem of poverty, especially with children and single moms.
Yeah. And what you incentivize and what you don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what you incentivize. And we saw that in the war on poverty. There was a terrific forum I participated in years ago. I think it was maybe National Review or somebody, but on, how did we do in the war on poverty? And it's like, we lost. And mainly because we didn't know what the enemy was. But the other thing, in terms of how these issues affect, the rest of the country, there's also a very, I think, realistic part of this conversation, which is, at the same time, no one's thinking that, a politician is going to settle this matter. There's like a single shot that's going to take care of it all, or that politics itself can change hearts and minds, because it can't. Now, does politics teach us Politics leads to government. Government leads to law. Law is a way of teaching us. And Roe taught America really, really bad things for a long time. This is the thesis of Ryan Anderson and Alexandra De Sanctis' book. How we deal with legal issues having to do with marriage. We'll look back on this 30, 40 years from now, Obergefell, kind of like what we have on Roe, and we'll see all the bad things that this bad law taught us about the fundamental pre-political realities of family. And it will be negative. And that's the kind of things we're trying to foresee. And at the same level, not expecting that we can get everything we want from one candidate or another, or that's, the only thing to ever think about. To say that it's a foundational issue is not the same as saying it's the only thing to think about. We're just trying to deal with the realities on the ground. And it is notable, by the way, that I think both parties have let out, trying to garner their votes on their side by basically pointing out how bad the other one is. And that in and of itself says something about where we're at. There's just a lot of realities on the ground so that, we go forward. And I say all that and go back to the question of why didn't you have someone who self-identified as a Democrat? It's important to note too, that the two individuals we had are not the only experts that we could have brought in. Both of them were more critical, one more critical of herself and how politics had created a sense of hatred for people. I thought she was really articulate on that point. And the other one, the other guest we had was very critical of this, departure of the GOP from the conservative platform or from the conservative philosophy. I thought that, very helpful. And at the same time, kind of landing where they personally do on the political stuff. But let me just say that one of the things I appreciated most about their contribution is that they were both really serious that being a Christian means you're a Christian first, and that there's a Christian way to be involved in the political process, both in terms of thinking about your own vote and in terms of thinking about the issues and in terms of thinking about others, particularly those, on the other side. And neither promoted some, unity at all cost milquetoast stuff that we hear so much about. The issues are too important to settle for that sort of nonsense. I've seen that, we saw that this week, and this, if it were on the other side, would be considered a Christian nationalist movement, evangelicals for Harris, movement. And it kind of goes to show that the word evangelical is in great peril when you're talking about a group of people, many of whom are lining up together in their support of a political candidate explicitly. And they're all over the map when it comes to theology. You got people on there who don't believe in the resurrection. You got people on there who claim that Jesus was homophobic and repented of it. You have people on there who, don't believe that humans are born sinful. You have people on there who are, basically believe that the most fundamental, essential part of a person's identity is the race that they did not choose to be a part of. There's nothing evangelical here about the majority of the people on that list. That's a Christian nationalist movement, essentially, according to this definition of Christianity, which is a pseudo-religious belief. So, there's just not an equivocation here that I'm going to offer because I don't think it exists.
John, I want to go now with you across the pond, and I'm already sorry I said that. There has been a lot of rioting and protesting going on in the UK over the past several weeks, and it's been unsettling in a sort of unexpected way as I've tried to read about this, which is that I truly do not know how to understand the news coverage about things like this anymore. So, for example, I'm reading a story in the BBC. So a few weeks ago, there was a horrible attack at a children's dance studio in a rural, I think, seaside community in the UK, where 3 little girls were killed. They were stabbed, and 8 other kids and 2 adults were injured. And the stabber was a 17-year-old who, I don't think police have released his name, but people assumed at the beginning that he was an immigrant And it turns out he was a UK citizen, so born in the UK. His parents were Rwandan. And I think that's those are the details that the media is sharing. I mean, he's a minor, so he is in custody. But this led to protests that were anti-immigration after this. And the UK has a very open and permissive immigration policy and has had for years. And the population in the UK is very close to, if it hasn't already turned over, where sort of the Anglo-Saxon native English people are in the minority, and the majority are people coming from the Middle East and Africa and other nations around them. But usually, this includes refugees, or, whether that's economic refugees or religious refugees or whatever it is. And so there's been a major cultural shift in the UK. So these protests have sort of erupted after that attack and then kind of spread. And now there's a protest movement happening in the UK. Hundreds of people have been arrested. Some police officers have been hurt. There's been a lot of violence and destruction of property. It feels similar. Does not at all seem to be at the same scale, but similar to the summer of 2020 here after the death of George Floyd, where it's kind of spreading to various cities. And then now I'm reading about counter protesters showing up to these protests. But one of the reasons this has been hard to parse is, again, I'm reading this BBC story, and it's like they're talking about the protests as being far right, anti-immigration, racist, and based on misinformation. And then they'll talk about counter protests, which are people who are coming to clean up the streets, and they're anti-racism protesters who are locking arms in front of the local mosque to help. And like at one point, there's a paragraph about this group of counter protesters who came up to protect their city from a far right racist, basically like UK equivalent of a Klan march. And then the last sentence in this paragraph is like, well, the Klan march never materialized. So then it's unclear, like, was there a march like that planned, or is that misinformation? Just these words like misinformation, what gets called a riot and what gets called a protest. It is so hard to determine exactly what's happening. And I think that's important to note because it's part of the bigger issue here, which is the cultural shift. So I also want to read to you a quote from this piece that a lot of us passed around this week. This was a piece on Substack by Joshua TREVIÑO, who is an American, but was traveling over in the UK for several weeks and like while all this was happening. And he mentioned in this piece, some stuff about he felt like the headlines might have been overblowing the violence or the unrest, that he was traveling around. He was in London, and I think he was in Cambridge, and he hadn't seen too much of it, it sounds like. But he had a really, really interesting take. And he's talking about the cultural shift being not just related to immigration and the, population turnover, because it's not just a turnover in ethnicity or race. It's also a turnover in culture and cultural ideas and ideas about what we were talking about in the last segment, the human person and the family and how society should be structured. But he said it's not just about the immigration. It's also about this new fad. And he sort of blamed American culture on this, where that American culture is kind of bled into UK culture, where the thing to do now, the trend is, if you're Anglo-Saxon or you're native to your country, is to learn to hate your country, to apologize for it, to spend, it's the trope of like, I think we talked about this on Mother's Day, because this is a bee in my bonnet, where like every Mother's Day now, before you say Happy Mother's Day to anybody, you have to spend 20 minutes apologizing for it. And you have to talk to all the people who wish they could be mothers and all the people who've lost their mother or lost their son. You have to apologize, and then maybe Happy Mother's Day to people who want to celebrate it. It feels that way with regards to Western culture. So I'm just going to read something quickly because he puts it better than I could. England belongs now mostly to the regime that propagandizes that her ancestors were evil and the structures that might have ordered her life are mere restraints to be overcome. And England belongs increasingly to the Islamic population of London and other cities that, unlike the English ruling classes, have the confidence and cohesion to assert and defend their own mores and folkways and traditions. That's the end of the quote. He talks about going to the British Museum, and he takes a picture of the gift shop, and it's just book after book after book talking about England's, terrible colonial history, its history with the slave trade, all the things that England should be ashamed of and apologize for. And he said nothing about Christianity, nothing about the positives that, nothing about Churchill basically turning the tide of the war and enduring the Blitzkrieg, kind of on their own and all this. There's none of that. It's all apologizing and the kind of self-flagellation. And that's a really toxic combination with this cultural shift as well.
Yeah. This is almost impossible to know, what the real story is on the ground over there. Neither of us have kind of gone over there, and fair enough. But it does seem to be kind of a way of bringing up our real hard and complicated relationship with our history that, if you don't have a story that's bigger than Western culture or bigger than your own kind of national history by which to measure and judge it, then something's going to be applied, some narrative. And it is interesting to see this contrast, right? I mean, we were watching an early episode, but it wasn't nearly as good as, Alone America, where these guys go up into, the Arctic and try to survive. Yeah. This was like Alone Australia.
Oh, I could not even watch it.
Well, the problem is there was 10 candidates and all of them started with a land acknowledgement. So they got dropped off and then they said, this land belongs to the Aboriginals. And so that's been kind of the easy way of saying, oh, in America, this is the fundamental bad story is, what happened to the, when these people came over and claimed land that wasn't theirs. And that's what happened in Australia. And that's what happened. Well, if you do a land acknowledgement in England, you're acknowledging that the Muslims who this land now, as he put it, belongs to. And I think that's probably an overstatement. I mean, are they doing, the kind of the colonial land grab that you're critiquing, you see what I mean?
What's funny about those two is that, like, if you really did it honestly, it would take you 2 hours. It belonged to this tribe, who stole it from that tribe, who took it from that tribe.
Yeah, it was quite a thing. And you know what changed all that? What changed all that? Christianity did.
I see where
this is how the Irish saved civilization. This is, the Christianization of England became, the story that stopped this kind of crazy history.
People committed the crazy history in the name of Christianity sometimes as well.
After that, and the colonialism and so on. Although at times they claimed it, at times it was in direct violation of it, and it was, Christian Britain who stopped the worst parts of this. For example, the slave trade. Yeah, and this is something that's interesting because as you have this push by British elites. And I think what makes it so interesting is it is such a little mirror, in a sense, across the pond of the same sort of conversations we're having here in America. But at the same time, you have British elites at the British Museum, kind of self-flagellating for the history. You have a whole group of British intellectuals going, man, if we lose Christianity, we're going to lose everything. You have this whole push to claim cultural Christianity from the Tom Hollands and even the Richard Dawkins, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a real, I think, conflict within the intelligentsia. You might say one outnumbers the other, certainly, but that's a pretty big voice when a Richard Dawkins steps up and goes, "Hey, we don't want this fully progressive vision," or Christian civilization's way better than Muslim civilization. Now, of course, as we've said in the past, you only get a cultural Christian if Christianity is true and if there are actual Christians doing culture. And that's the history. It's not just the history of this kind of random cloud that settled over London called Christianity, that didn't actually have any substance to it. There were actual Christians thinking about law, and there were actual Christians that were thinking about slavery, and there were actual Christians, thinking about morality and thinking about the place of a church in that context, a state church and how that fits with the monarchy and everything else. That there were actual Christians doing that. and then applying it more broadly.
That's so cool. Like if you look at the French Revolution, I feel like that is an example. The Enlightenment is an example of people pretending that you can have Christian culture without Christianity. And look how quickly that devolved into just neighbor on neighbor bloodshed and tyranny. It just doesn't work.
You know, we've kind of skirted around this for various segments on this program, but I think it was, I don't know, maybe about a year or more, maybe more, where Glenn Sunshine primarily authored a piece that we did on Breakpoint, and he and I went back and forth on it a good bit. But this idea that wokeism is a Christian heresy, that you start, for example, looking at a narrative of oppression, and that is a way of taking, a very real category of human rights and then kind of corrupting it because it's not grounded in anything eternal. It's not grounded in anything valuable. And of course, that's the sort of thing that has made Tom Holland and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Richard Dawkins kind of back off of this full-on secularism, is that secularism gave wokeism, and wokeism is not really going to give the same thing that the Christian background is going to give. But it would be interesting to do maybe more direct comparisons between, what they're seeing, and kind of warning about, like, we don't want where this is going. We don't want this, constant guilt by one group and constant moral, with what I'm looking for, preference or moral superiority from another group to kind of become the new framework by which we see law and economic justice and and criminal justice and immigration law and everything else. We don't want that because it's not going to end well. That's what they're pushing back against. And it would be interesting to do a more direct comparison with the French Revolution.
I've kind of gone on a horseshoe journey with some of this. Like, I know a couple of months ago, I asked you, we talked about that day I went shopping in this big shopping plaza and all of a sudden heard, the call to prayer kind of blaring, the Muslim call to prayer, and people in the parking lot and whatnot were doing it. And, 5-10 years ago, or when I was in college or whenever, I recognize, I have confidence in my faith. I also truly value religious freedom for obvious reasons, and not just for me, but for everyone. And that's part of what makes this country wonderful. And, if this group doesn't have religious freedom, then I don't have religious freedom because X, Y, and Z. And I still think all of that is true. But I've also come back around to some cultural ideas are better than other cultural ideas. So, if I'm down at the park down the street and I see a group of women walking in, full burqa, right? So completely covered, just the little slit for the eyes. 10 years ago, I'm thinking, man, it's cool that we have such a diverse neighborhood. And I'm glad that, how interesting that they're here. It'll be cool to teach my kids about this. Now I'm to the point where I feel more and more comfortable thinking things like, we don't do that here. And it's not because you're not welcome or you're a worse person, but it's because that's not good. That's that the worldview that is teaching you these things is based on a lie. And also there are real practical dangers to a culture that allows that to become more and more prevalent, not just dangers to women, but dangers of security. I mean, this has been a debate forever now because police are like, you can't identify suspects if they're covered all the time or even victims. And so that's its own thing. And I feel more and more comfortable, and I'm not coming at this from a place of fragility, like Christianity won't be able to survive if all these other religions come in and are given equal consideration. I don't believe that at all, obviously. But I do believe that some ideas lead to human flourishing and others lead to incredible pain and suffering. And this is exactly what he was writing about in this essay, where he said, the Islamic population has the confidence and cohesion to assert and defend their own mores and folkways and traditions. Basically saying, if we're going to spend all this time self-flagellating and pretending that our highest ideal is, diversity and plurality and freedom, they're not doing the same thing because they don't have the same ideas. And I respect that about them, but you better get real about it, because their intention is for there to be no such thing as religious freedom or what we'd consider basic human rights. And you need to be paying attention to that, because the more and more people that come into your country, especially, it's going to impact your culture. It's going to impact the safety of your people.
Well, and there's two other factors here kind of shaping this. And that's when we get to this myth of neutrality that I think some of these folks are realizing. This is a great example, your example of the call to prayer at a mall in America, right? Because, you know, I have some friends right now who have been dealing with an ordinance that goes all the way back, 100 years or so, where a religious group had access to a public space, a beach. And they basically have ownership of this. And for their Sunday mornings, they have, not had public access to the beach granted. And they're saying, you can't do that. You can't do that. In other words, that public infringement is not allowed for Christians. But that same right then, if somebody can blast a call to prayer across the mall, you see, what's a subtext here is this myth of neutrality. Like, there's this equal claim on all of life, and it's just not the case. Secularism sees religion as being personal and private. Islam does not. By the way, Christianity does not either, but Christianity does have this kind of freedom of conscience that comes along with it, or it should. And anyway, I think that's one of the big subtexts that's missing here, is that we're not talking about two groups that have in self-understanding, a same self-understanding, and the claim on society. There's not a peaceful coexistence. You might want to sell that bumper sticker, but that's not how, certain religions see the world. And the other subtext here is just that there are always been, and there should be, limits on religious freedom. Once you get into things that are forcing religious views on others or causing direct harm, this idea of neutrality, we're bringing a cannibal religion, and right. You're not going to create any space for that, and you shouldn't create any space for that. So listen, these things aren't super easy to always play out or to figure out. And they certainly have to be applied in cultural settings that are dramatically different. What's happening in, one neighborhood in Columbus and what's happening in another neighborhood in Columbus is different enough, not to mention when you go from, Manhattan to, Valdosta, Georgia. We're talking about very, very different places. But that's just the reality of religious belief. And it's the reality of the religious claims of these various religions. And when we lose sight of that, we also lose sight of the fact that secularism is a religion, at least in the sense that it has religious commitments and it demands allegiance and so on. And, that's where these things collide.
John, quickly, I want to mention another Breakpoint commentary that you shared this week that you wrote along with Michaela S. Truth, one of our former interns who's now back at Hillsdale, Michaela S. Truth. Just kind of looking at the slow marching back of the DEI initiatives, which of course is diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of these things that popped up after the protests of 2020 and the anti-racism movement, whatever. Basically, every major corporation in America, at least it felt that way, announced that they were going to have this brand new section of their, this brand new division in their corporations called DEI. And they were going to make sure that their workforce was diverse and that everybody had sensitivity training and anti-racism training, whatever that is. And now it feels like, it's been a few years and a lot of companies are not only walking that back, but doing so publicly. So, for example, you all wrote about John Deere making a public statement, so the tractor company, which you might be asking yourselves, did John Deere really come out in 2020 and say, like, we're complicit in racism and we're so sorry and we're going to do all this to stop? Yes, they did. Yes, they did, in fact. And now they've come out and said, okay, they are no longer going to do things like funding pride parades. They're going to remove their socially motivated messaging from their training materials. Basically, they're going to stop considering themselves a political actor and just sell tractors. And then Tractor Supply did the same thing. One wonders if that was a bit of business competition there, accomplishing some good. But there's a bunch of other major companies. I mean, we talked earlier in the year about Target kind of having a much quieter Pride Month, and a lot of cities around America, I mean, still having Pride parades, but they seemed to suffer a little bit in the way of corporate sponsorships this year, in ways they haven't in past years. So do you think this is a positive sign that people are backing off of DEI?
Yeah, it's early. It's certainly early, but people are showing up. I think that's really the key point of the narrative right now, is that it's no longer a situation where it's going unchallenged. And I think especially at the corporate level, and that is meaningful in two directions. Number one is that there was just kind of this air of inevitability that this was just going to march over us and there was nothing we could do about it. And it was understandable. I mean, last June we talked about this. It just felt like, what are we going to do? It's like it's everywhere, over and over and over. But also because in the history of social movements, when the corporate sphere, we talked about different spheres and how that matters in a Kuyperian vision, that each of these spheres needs to take. Well, if you talk about kind of business, and how culture is kind of overrun with an ideology, good or bad, or there's a social revolution. When the marketplace gets involved, it carries a really, really big point of leverage. You can see this in terms of the businessman's revival in the early 1900s in New York, and the power that it had in maintaining Christianity in a increasingly secular city. You can talk about the sexual revolution and this collision with religious freedom that took place back primarily in the state of Indiana, and when that RFRA bill was being debated back in 2014, and then Governor Mike Pence and what happened there. And there's just all kinds of places, and we can look at the LGBTQ movement and we can say, yeah, man, it got schools quickly. It certainly got theater and the arts and television quickly. But man, when it started going into everyday places where people shop and do commerce, that was a whole nother thing. And a lot of these places have backed off this year. Target took a big hit, and deservedly so, for having, kind of a satanic transitioning, fashion thing that they had going on. Bud Light took a big hit, and rightfully so. And so there was just, I think, a way of noticing. And I remember being at a meeting years ago, thinking about some of these things and talking about some of these things with others. And, somebody who was a genius, and I'll leave him unnamed
was it me?
I haven't gotten his permission. It was not you.
Oh, too bad.
It was somebody else who said, look, we just need to neutralize this. They started to recognize the fact that the demands by the HRC and some of these other groups to get corporate compliance was not just corporate compliance, it was corporate activism. And the cost would be perceived as being too great for them not to be involved. So they were going to do things like sensitivity training. They were going to do various DEI initiatives, and they were going to, want to get the HRC seal of approval, that they could advertise on their websites or on their storefronts. And he said, what we need is just somebody to bring them back to neutral. That's it. You just got to have somebody bring them back to neutral, so that if the activist calls the shareholder, the other side calls the shareholder and says, or the board member, and says, you don't want to be involved in this. Okay, we're going to set it out. And we're starting to see that strategy is actually working, because there are folks that are actually employing that strategy, and it's working. Now, is the game over? No. Will there be a counterplay? Yes. But it's if you want to know more about this, follow Robby Starbuck on X. He's the one that's reporting on this. He's been doing stuff all week on Harley Davidson. And you kind of think about John Deere and Tractor Supply and Harley Davidson being, really aggressive in their DEI policies. And you think, this is madness. Everybody knows off the top of their head what the demographic of these.
Right. Like, what is the customer profile?
Customer demographic is. Yeah. Who's shopping at Tractor Supply? Now, John Deere and Tractor Supply, I don't know. Tractor Supply really did a 180, it seems. John Deere's backpedaled pretty heavily. Harley Davidson's under a lot of fire. And you can do this by just bringing attention to it. And so good for him. Good for him for doing it. And I think we did see at least a muted Pride Month. A lot of people noticed it. The reason we noticed it is because it wasn't in every storefront like it was last year. The parades were just as obnoxious, particularly the aggressiveness towards children. And I don't think those of us who think this is bad for society and also bad for children in particular can shut up about this. It's not good. There's things being allowed in the name of pride that would have gotten people arrested a generation ago. So, and I think we need to continue to say that out loud. There was less enthusiasm on the part of corporations, and it's because of this work that's happening. It's worth mentioning. It ain't over, but it's a great start, and there's more to be done. And I think that the other thing that we've seen on this is just a willingness to say something. Don't accept it as normal. We told the story of, again, I don't want to name names, but a handful of us dealing with just our church downtown. Small win, still frustrating, but small win.
Mm-hmm.
What else? What can we walk in and just refuse to participate in this or that or the other? And I think that it's not the same thing as a boycott. It's not the same thing as being obnoxious. It's not the same thing as any of that, although those things may be called for as well. But what can we do? And maybe if everybody does something, everybody does something. It's that spiral of silence thing that Chuck Colson talked about. And I think we're seeing that spiral of silence on this be broken because there was this air of inevitability that clearly isn't the case. Mm-hmm. And that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, John, this makes me think of Miss Bendova, the woman that you interviewed at the Colson conference alongside Rod Dreher. She was featured in his book. She and her husband had young children under the Soviet regime in the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic, in the 80s. And he was put in jail partly because, it started because the local Communist Party chapter, however that worked, wanted them to put flags in their window to celebrate the anniversary of whatever, the communist takeover. And they just said no. And that started a whole snowball thing. Like, I've reflected so much on this since then. She was an incredible person to hear from. But just that was such a small decision. But once she did it, they joined a community of other people that were kind of starting to push back. And you could tell, like, her neighbors were like, oh, I didn't realize that was a thing you could say no to. And it kind of wasn't. Her husband went to jail for a couple of years. It was really, really hard on that family. But that's not in terms of complexity, that's not a big decision. It was just like, why would I do that? This is a death cult. I'm seeing you take over my country. There's no way I'm putting that in my window. And I haven't approached anything near that in my own life, but I've certainly, stopped filling out my pronouns when I go to the doctor and brought it up and said, I think it's weird you guys have this on here, and, talked to my librarian about the books they have, just little things like that, just to register it, because it does make a difference. It does move the needle. I will say, though, I have less hope and less optimism about government DEI initiatives. So this week I went down a rabbit hole for a reporting project and was looking at my city's budget. What's so weird about this on many levels is that we've had the same mayor for several years, since before 2020. And if you go on the mayor's website or the city's website, you'll get a little PR paragraph about how this city is up and coming and it's a great place to raise a family and it's a wonderful place. And then the second paragraph is, this is a post-apocalyptic world if you're a minority. We are just seething with racism, and there's racism in every corner of our government and society, and we need to do X, Y, and Z to fix it. And at some point you want to be like, man, you've been mayor for several years. Like, have you not moved the needle at all? Feels like you've been talking about this for a long time. But our DEI budget in my city has doubled every year since it became a thing. They now employ 14 full-time people. They have set aside money for some initiatives that, as far as I can tell, have never even happened, don't exist, but they're getting all this money every year, and God only knows where it's going, which is yet another reason for us to be involved in our government. But I'm hopeful that what we're seeing in corporate America, even if it's happening slowly, will ultimately make its way to government. But I have a little bit less optimism about that because people don't have the time or the patience or the attention span to track where their money is going, their tax money. And that's unfortunate.
Well, I think the point, and this is full circle back to where we began, but if the rest of culture gives us the buffer that it's supposed to be from the government, then it's going to become less important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the hope. Well, John, let's talk about recommendations real quickly. I'll just recommend really quickly. First, I have to thank somebody because a very sweet listener sent me the first Hank the Cowdog book to give to my oldest daughter. And that was so sweet and thoughtful and such a fun thing to get in the mail. And my daughter is just the right age for it and is very, very excited to read it. So if you guys remember, I mean, it's probably been over a year, John, you were teasing me for not knowing what Hank the Cowdog is. It Hank? It's Hank. Hank the Cowdog is. It's a cowboy dog. It's a sheriff dog or something like that. And John was telling me he couldn't believe I didn't know what it was. And so now my daughter gets to read it.
It's neither of those things. He's the head of ranch security.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Hank. I misranked you. Thank you so much for sending that. That was incredibly sweet. My other just light recommendation is school starting, and school started this week for my kiddos. And this is a super crazy, hectic time of year, especially for small and private schools and Christian schools and teachers. So please be praying for them and look for ways that maybe you can help them. This was part of my frustration going down the rabbit hole of my city's budget this week, is just thinking what some of these schools could do with a fraction of this money that goes who knows where. But if you have a local school, even if your kids aren't in it, if you have a local private or Christian school, just commit to pray for them and reach out to them and see if there's a way you could help or supplies they need, because I'm sure they could all use it and it would go far. So that's my recommendation. Shout out to Tree of Life Christian Schools.
Well, my recommendation is on Monday is the anniversary of the death of Blaise Pascal. We had an incredible conversation about this in our editorial meeting. I've loved Pascal for a long time for a number of reasons. He's one of those guys that I look at and go, it makes me doubt God's providence. And here's what I mean by that. He died in his 30s. And he was just turning his attention to writing this massive apologetic project, and what he got, which Enlightenment thinkers a generation later still found formidable, who were trying to oppose theism and Christian theism and Christianity. And I mean, Voltaire just had this hang up with Pascal.
I've read New Atheist guys talk about how he's the hardest one to interact with. His writings. And
he was brilliant. I mean, one of the most brilliant mathematicians, and he dies in his 30s. I think about Pascal, and I often think about Nabil Qureshi. Nabil, who passed away of cancer, and a Muslim convert, given the things we talked about in today's program and the timeliness of his witness. Just brilliant. And so you kind of think, what could have happened? But his writing, his work was put together as a collection of thoughts. The French word here is pensées. And if you don't have that book, buy it. And my recommendation, and this is going to sound a little odd, but this is a book you can read in bite-sized chunks. There we go.
Okay, very good. Well, that is going to do it for the program this week. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. If you missed the Breakpoint Forum earlier this week about Christians engaging in politics and how and whether we do that, we are going to have that footage available for you sometime in this coming week. And that was the forum that we had with John, Eric Tietzel, and Denise Skitsum. That is going to be something you don't want to miss. So make sure you check back at breakpoint.org and we'll have that footage available for you this week. Otherwise, have a wonderful week. We'll see you all back here next week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet. God bless.